The road back was the same road it had always been. Limestone gravel packed hard by decades of cartwheels, flanked on both sides by oaks old enough to have witnessed the construction of the walls ahead. He watched the branches move past the carriage window and observed without particular interest that the season had turned in his absence. The leaves were beginning to shift their color. He noted this the way he noted most things, as a fact requiring no response. He turned from the window. The papers beside him on the seat represented 3 weeks of work in the capital correspondence, completed contracts witnessed. A boundary dispute between 2 tenant families settled through an intermediary, with terms favorable enough to both parties that neither would need to approach him directly upon his return. He had arranged it precisely so. He always preferred to return to order. It was one of the few preferences he had allowed to become a practice, because a preference, held long enough and applied with sufficient consistency, became indistinguishable from good administration. He straightened the stack by habit, aligning the edges, and set them aside. The carriage rounded the last bend, and he did not lean toward the window to look. He knew what he would see: the pale stone face of the outer wall, the east tower with its slight, permanent lean, a settling issue from his grandfather's era that 3 different architects had assured him was structurally inconsequential. The iron gate, replaced 2 winters ago, which now swung without the grinding reluctance of its predecessor. He had catalogued every element of this place the way men catalogue things they own and intend to keep home. The word arrived, uninvited, somewhere behind his sternum. He did not examine it. There was nothing to examine. He returned to this place as he returned to everything that belonged to him, without sentiment, without ceremony, with the kind of deliberate efficiency that had served him well in the 10 years since the title came to him. The carriage was slowing. He gathered himself. It stopped. He stepped down before the footman had finished positioning the mounting step. An old habit, this, and the crunch of gravel beneath his boot was the first thing he registered. The second was the gate standing open in the outer wall, which was expected. The third was something he had no immediate name for: a quality in the air, a texture to the quiet that was not quite right. He paused on the gravel. The grounds of an estate this size were never silent. There was always the sound of work: the stable yard, the kitchen wing, the laundry, the gardeners who moved through the outer hedges in the last weeks before winter made that work impossible. He had returned at this hour on many different occasions, and the sound had always been there, as unremarkable and constant as the walls themselves. It was not there now. He could not have said what precisely was missing, only that something was. He crossed the outer courtyard without altering his pace. He was a man who did not slow when he was uncertain. He had understood early that uncertainty worn openly was simply weakness made visible, and he had no patience for unnecessary visibility. The entrance doors were closed. He opened the left one himself, stepped across the threshold, and stopped. The hall was as he had left it, stone floor, the long table against the west wall, the 2 chairs flanking the hearth, which was cold and had been cold for some time, judging by the ash, every object in its place, everything in order. And the silence was enormous. Not the silence of a late hour, or a sleeping household, or a staff occupied in rooms beyond earshot. This was something he had not encountered here before, a quality of emptiness that seemed to have settled into the walls, the way cold settles into stone, deeply and without hurry. He stood very still in the doorway. He was practiced at standing still. He could not name what was wrong. He did not yet understand that this was because the thing that was missing was not a sound. He moved through the hall. The fireplace was code, which he had already established. The chairs beside it sat in their usual arrangement, the smaller one angled toward the window, exactly as it had always been. The long table against the west wall held what it had always held, a ceramic bowl that had occupied that spot for years, a pair of candlesticks that no one ever moved. He walked past all of it. He was not here to inspect the furniture. The passage toward the east wing was dim, the autumn light falling at an angle that left the floor in partial shadow. This was unremarkable. He had walked this passage 10,000 times. What he knew rather less well was the sound of it in this particular quiet. There should have been a fire in the second reception room by now, and he found he could identify its absence by the corresponding absence of warmth in the air to his left as he passed the doorway. There should have been voices from the kitchen corridor. The kitchen sat at the far end of the east wing, and its sounds traveled along the passage at this hour. A low and distant industry he had never consciously attended to and had apparently been cataloguing for years without knowing it. Those sounds were gone. So was the faint metallic accompaniment of early preparations for the evening meal. He stopped in the middle of the passage and listened. The silence was not complete. Wind moved somewhere in the upper parts of the building. The gallery window, most likely. The one that had never been properly resealed after the storm's 2 seasons past. Outside the walls, very faintly, a horse shifted weight near the stable block. The world beyond the castle's interior was continuing without incident. He started walking again. There was a reasonable explanation. The housekeeper had written to him during his second week away, a letter he had read quickly, on a morning taken up by other matters, and filed in the part of his mind reserved for household affairs that would resolve themselves without his direct involvement. He had some recollection of the letter mentioning an inventory. Autumn was the correct season for it. Inventories of this scale occasionally required a full reorganization of ordinary schedules. The staff concentrated on one task at the expense of usual routine. He had not retained the specifics, because the specifics had not seemed to require attention. That was the explanation. He was satisfied with it. He reached the turning in the passage that led toward the private rooms, and slowed without deciding to. The door at the end of the short corridor, the room that had become hers over the course of the past year, in the way that rooms quietly assign themselves to the people who use them most, was closed. It was always closed. She had some private arrangement with herself about closed doors, something he had noticed without asking about, the way he had never asked about most things that were only her own. The closed door meant nothing different than it had meant yesterday and the day before. He did not open it. He stood in the corridor for a moment. He did not track, looking at the closed door, and then walked past it and took the left turning toward the library. The library was empty, in the manner of rooms that contain no one. He went to the reading table near the window, the one she favored in the afternoons, a fact he knew because he had sometimes passed the doorway and seen her there, though he had never entered when she was working. And he looked at the surface. One of his own books lay open to a page he did not read, nothing else. The small inkwell and the pen with the narrow handle that had appeared on this table several months ago, arriving so gradually that he had not noticed their coming, were not there. He noticed, now very clearly, their absence. He looked at the space where they had been for some time before he moved. Then he went to the library doorway and called for the housekeeper. He called once into the passage. His own voice sounded wrong inside, the silence too present for it, answered by nothing. No footstep on the stone, no voice returning from any direction within the castle's considerable interior. The silence that had felt passive when he arrived at the gate was not passive now. He had checked the kitchens and found them empty in a way that went beyond the emptiness of a late hour. Cold hearths, nothing cooling, no evidence of interrupted work. He had checked the small parlor off the main passage. He had checked the room beside it. He had opened 2 doors he had not opened in months, and stood in their thresholds, looking at rooms he could not determine, on inspection, whether she had been in recently, or whether the tidiness was simply the tidiness of long disuse. He was moving faster than he would have acknowledged. He told himself as he climbed the stairs toward the upper floor that this was reasonable behavior given the circumstances. A household that had not appeared for the evening routine, an unanswered call to the housekeeper, a general stillness that the autumn inventory hypothesis was becoming less and less adequate to explain. Any responsible person with an estate of this size would conduct precisely this kind of survey. There was nothing unusual about moving quickly through your own house in order to understand what was happening in it. He passed the door to her sitting room and stopped. He went back. The door was slightly ajar. Not open, not closed, held in the gap between those 2 states in a way that was neither careless nor deliberate. He put his hand to it and pushed it open. The room was intact. This was what he noticed first, and it was not the relief he had been half expecting. The small chair near the window sat at its usual angle. The low table had accumulated, over many months, the particular assortment of objects that gathers around a person who spends time in a room. A book left face down, a folded cloth, a small cup that had not been washed, a candle burned to a stub in a holder she had brought from somewhere he had never thought to ask about. The room looked as it looked every evening when he happened to pass by its open door. It looked as though she had stepped out for a moment. He stood in the doorway and looked at it. And then he looked at the writing table. She used the writing table most mornings. He knew this without knowing when he had learned it, the way he knew the direction her chair faced and the particular quality of light she preferred, and a number of other things about her daily arrangements that he had absorbed without ever deciding to pay attention. The writing table was against the wall beside the window. On the center of its surface, in the small, clear space she kept for correspondence, there was a folded piece of paper. He crossed to it. The paper was folded once and closed without wax, and on the outside, in her handwriting, was his name. He did not touch it. He became aware of a sensation in his chest, that he did not have an accurate word for. Not pain, not exactly, though it occupied the same territory. Something with the quality of recognition, as though some part of him had known since the first moment at the outer gate and had been constructing explanations at increasing effort in order to postpone arriving at this exact point, this table, this room, this piece of paper with his name on the outside in her particular hand. He looked at the room. He looked at it properly, for the first time since he had entered, and what he saw was not the chair and the book and the small objects on the table. What he saw was the quality of those things. The book, left face down, was not the book of a person who had set it aside and would return to it in an hour. It was the book of a person who had left a room they did not intend to come back to. He could not have explained how he knew this distinction. He knew it entirely. The small cup, the candle stub, the folded cloth, they all had the quality of things that had not been forgotten but had been left. There was a difference between those 2 states that he had never previously needed to understand, and he understood it now completely, standing in the evening light of her sitting room, which was perfectly intact, exactly as she had arranged it, and from which she was not going to return. He reached down and picked up the note. It was lighter than he had expected. He stood with it in his hand, not opening it, looking at the window, rather than at the paper he was holding. The castle was silent in all directions, an absolute silence that had been accumulating since the gate, and that was complete now. He was aware that his hands were steady, and that the steadiness was costing him something he was only beginning to calculate, and that whatever was written inside the fold would become entirely true the moment he read it, more fully true than it was in this moment, though it was not possible to say it was not yet true. He looked down at his own name in her handwriting. He did not open it. He opened it. The paper unfolded in 2 movements, the crease clean and exact, the way her things always were, and he held it open in both hands and looked at her handwriting before he had read a single word, on notes about household accounts, on the margins of books she had borrowed and returned with small penciled remarks on a letter she had sent once to the capital when a matter could not wait. He had read all of those without difficulty. This was the same hand, the same particular slant to the letters, the same loops in certain characters that were distinctive to her script and no one else's. He was not reading it. He was standing in her room, looking at the shape of the words as though he needed to complete some preliminary task before he was permitted to proceed to the meaning. He read, she had not begun with his title. She had not begun with any formal salutation, which was unusual and, in some way, he could not immediately account for. More like her than a conventional opening would have been. The note began, I have been trying to find a way to say this to you for a long time, longer, if I am being honest with myself, than I can accurately account for. I have tried to say it in person and found that I could not. So I am saying it here, which is the only way I have ever been able to be entirely honest about the things that have mattered most to me. He stopped. He read it again. He was not yet past the opening lines, and the silence of the room was so complete that he was aware of the sound of the paper between his fingers. She had been trying to say something. Not for a week, not since some incident during his absence, for a long time, something she had attempted to say to his face and could not manage. He had been in rooms with her for more mornings than he could count, had sat across from her at tables, had passed her in corridors, and entered rooms she was already occupying and left without ceremony. And he had not known that she was trying to say something to him. He had not noticed. He became aware, standing in the fading light of her sitting room with the note open between his hands, that there was a very substantial category of things about her that he had not noticed. The memory arrived without warning. She had been sitting at this window, exactly this window, with the same autumn quality of light falling through the glass at the same angle. And she had been reading something, and she had glanced up at a sound in the passage, and then returned to the page, and he had passed the open doorway and registered her presence, because there was somewhere he had been going, and her being there had simply been what it always was, a feature of the room he was moving through. He had not stopped. She had not looked up again. He did not know which morning this was. He could not have said what she had been reading, or whether she had heard his step in particular and chosen not to call out. He did not know why this image had organized itself now out of all the mornings he had passed this doorway, except that the light was the same, and she was not in it, and he was looking at the window from the same angle at which he would have seen her, and the chair was empty. He returned his eyes to the page. I'm not writing this with any intention of distressing you. I know you well enough to know that you prefer to arrive at things in your own time, by your own reasoning, and I'm not asking you to feel anything in particular. But I cannot leave without saying this, because some things cannot be left unsaid without ceasing, in some important way, to be true. And I have kept this one unsaid for long enough. He read back over the last line. She had written those words here, in this room, before she walked out of it. She had known she was leaving when she set down those words. She had composed this, folded it, placed it, and then left. Not in disorder, not impulsively, but with the careful deliberateness of a person who had been deciding for a long time. The note was not an act of a moment. Neither was what had driven her to write it. He set it down on the table. He stood looking at it. His hands were not entirely steady. Then he picked it up again. The note continued. He had expected. He did not know exactly what he had expected. Some accounting of grievances, perhaps. Something formal and precise that he could have held at a measured distance and assessed with the same composure he applied to complicated correspondence. What followed the lines he had already read was not that. The note read, "I have not been unhappy here. I want to be clear about this before I say anything else, because I know what I am about to write will be easy to misread, and I would rather you understand me correctly even if you have never particularly tried to before. Living in this house has been, I will use the word precisely, a privilege. The quiet of the mornings, the library, the particular way the light comes through the east windows in winter. These things have been genuinely mine, and I am grateful for them." He was reading slowly. "The difficulty is not the life. The difficulty is what I discovered about myself inside it." He stopped. He read the sentence again. Then he read forward. "I found some time ago, I will not tell you exactly when, because I am not certain I could name the moment, and the when seems less important than the what, that I had come to feel something I had not intended to feel, and could not undo. I tried to undo it. I mention this, not to suggest that the effort was your fault, but because I want you to have an accurate account. I was not careless about this. He stood very still in the center of the room. I loved you. I will write it plainly, since I have decided to be honest in this letter, and there is no version of honesty that permits me to avoid this particular sentence. I loved you. I do not know what you will do with this. I am not asking you to do anything with it. I am telling you because it was the truest thing I knew, and because I cannot write the truest letter I have ever written and leave it out." The room was absolutely still around him. He did not move. The sentence sat on the page, 3 words, and then some lines later, the same 3 words again, and he stood over it and could not continue and could not look away. He had not been prepared for the plainness of it. He had not been prepared for the repetition, "I loved you," written once, and then "I loved you," written again, as though she had set it down and looked at it and determined that once was not sufficient to be clear. The memories came without order. A morning she had been at the breakfast table before him and had looked up when he entered and then returned to whatever she had been reading. And he had taken his seat and opened his correspondence, and they had occupied the same room for the better part of an hour in a silence he had found entirely unremarkable. An afternoon when he had passed the library doorway and heard her voice, low, not directed at him, perhaps directed at the page in front of her or at nothing in particular. And he had walked on without asking. A late evening when he had seen light still showing under her door and thought only that she kept late hours and gone on to his own rooms without a second thought, he saw all of these differently now. The same rooms, the same silences, the same quality of her presence in the periphery of his attention, but the contents of those moments had changed completely. She had been loving him in every one of them. He had been moving through them toward somewhere else, occupied with something else, somewhere entirely else in every single one. He made himself read on. "I am not leaving because of anything you did. I want to be clear about that as well. You were not unkind. You were what you are, and I knew what you were before I understood what I felt, and so I cannot claim I was not warned. I am leaving because I know now that I will not stop, and staying has become something I cannot do and remain what I want to be." The note was nearly finished. A few lines remained. "I have not told anyone where I am going, and I am asking you, in the plainest terms I am capable of, not to look for me. This is not a gesture. It is a practical request from someone who knows how your mind works and who is asking you to work it in this one direction. Let me go because it is right, and because you are a practical man, and because I believe that in time you will see I am correct. Take care of yourself. I mean that. He was still holding the note. Both hands. The room was dark now. The light had been failing since he entered and was gone, and he was standing in the dark of her sitting room with the finished letter in his hands, and nothing left to read. He stayed. The light had failed entirely by the time he understood this about himself. He was still in her sitting room, standing in the same position he had occupied when he finished the last line, and a significant amount of time had passed. He could tell by the darkness and by the cold, which had deepened from the ambient chill of an unheated room. He was still holding the note. She had loved him. He did not examine the sentence as a sentence. He stood in the dark of her room and let the fact of it exist in him, and it was quite unlike anything he had previously been required to absorb. He had received difficult news before. He had managed it, had moved through it toward the necessary action. There was no necessary action here. There was only the note in his hands, and the dark, and the fact that she had loved him and he had not known it, and he could not determine precisely what kind of man it required to have shared a house with someone for the better part of a year and not known. He sat down. He was not certain he had decided to sit. The chair was there, her chair, the smaller one she kept near the window. And he was in it, and he did not remember crossing to it. He sat with the note in his hands and looked at the dark rectangle of the window and could not feel anything in particular, which was itself a feeling he had no category for. He had always been able to feel nothing when nothing was required of him. He had believed this was a skill. He understood now that he had been confusing a skill with an absence, and that the absence had been what she saw when she looked at him and found a man who did not know she was there. She had tried to undo it. He had not known she was trying to undo anything. He had been across the table from her, and in the same rooms and the same corridors, and he had known nothing of what was occurring inside her, had not once thought to ask. She had carried this for how long? Not a week, not a recent thing, something she could not accurately date. She had been carrying it through all the mornings he had sat across from her in a silence he had considered comfortable. The silence in the room was not comfortable. It was the particular silence of a space vacated by someone specific, and he was sitting in the center of it in her chair, and he was a duke, and that title now struck him as the single most irrelevant fact about himself. He had understood himself to be a man who managed things. That had been the whole of his self-accounting. He managed. He returned from difficult situations having handled them. He resolved disputes and witnessed contracts and arranged matters so that he could come back to order. He had thought order was the point. He had thought efficiency was the same as care. He had not thought about it at all. That was what the note said about who he was, that he had not thought about it at all. She had been in this room, and at that table, and across from him at meals, and she had been loving him through all of it, and he had been present in the same building and entirely absent from her. He had catalogued the book she left face down, the late light burning under her door, the particular quality of her handwriting, and he had not assembled any of it into a person who needed him to look at her. The castle was quiet around him. He understood what the silence was now. It was the shape of what she had been. An entire person had been in this building, and she was gone. And the silence was not an absence of noise. It was the specific absence of her. The silence had been there when he arrived, and he had tried to explain it with inventories and schedules, and it had been this the whole time, just her gone. She was not coming back. She had said so. She had accounted for the possibility that he would think to look for her, and had asked him plainly not to. She had written the close of the letter as the close of something complete, not an opening left for response. He folded the note. He folded it along its original crease, the one she had made, and placed it on the writing table, where he had found it, in the center of the cleared space she had kept for correspondence. He sat for a moment longer in her chair looking at it. Then he looked at the window. Outside the grounds were dark and still. The same grounds he had ridden through that morning on the same road he had always taken. He had not known what he was returning to, and the not knowing had not seemed like a deficiency. That was the last thing he understood. Before the understanding became too large to continue examining, he did not leave. He sat in her chair in the dark, with the note on the table in front of him, in the silent castle, knowing now what the silence had meant from the moment he arrived. He did not leave. He was not the man who would have left, and the man who had arrived that morning, who would have left, who would have found the practical response, who would have resumed his duties and allowed the household to normalize. That man was no longer exactly present. He was not certain where he had gone. He was sitting in the chair, in the room in the dark, and that was all he knew about himself. He was in the chair when the light came back. He had not meant to sleep, and he was not certain he had. He was simply in one moment, and then in another, with the grey of early morning replacing the dark at the window, and the note still on the table in front of him where he had placed it. His back ached from the chair. The room was very cold. He was still in his traveling coat. He did not move immediately. The note was there. He looked at it for a while without reaching for it. The second reading was not the same as the first. The first time he had read it the way he always read things he did not want to read, at a controlled pace, holding himself at a distance from the meaning, attending to the words as words. He had not been able to hold that distance past the opening lines, but he had tried. The second time he already knew everything the letter contained, and knowing released him into the sentences themselves. He attended to each one as he had not managed the night before. He read the opening passage. "I have been trying to find a way to say this to you for a long time, Aristocratic," and he sat with what it meant to have been living alongside someone who was in the act of trying to say something to him. He had not made it easy. He understood that clearly now. He had not made it easy, and he had not known he was not making it easy. And that second fact was the one that sat heaviest of all the heavy facts the letter contained. He set the note on his knee and looked at the window. Outside, the grounds were grey and still. He had ridden through them yesterday. He had been thinking about something, correspondence, he thought, or one of the disputes he had settled in the capital. He could not recall what. He was still sitting there when the door opened. He did not stand. This was unusual. He always stood when someone entered a room. A habit so ingrained, he had never needed to think about it. But he did not stand, and the young woman who had opened the door, one of the kitchen staff by her dress, stopped when she saw him and made the particular uncertain movement of a person who has opened a door and found the wrong thing on the other side of it. He asked her where she had gone. He did not use her name. Not because he could not, but because her name in his mouth was something he was not yet ready to manage. He said only, had she told anyone where she was going? The young woman delivered this with the careful caution of someone carrying news they know to be unwelcome. She had left the previous morning, some hours before his arrival. She had taken her things, one bag, possibly two. She had not told anyone of substance where she intended to go. She had left in a hired coach toward the main road, from which there were several routes she could have taken, and no one had thought to note which. He thanked the woman and said nothing further, and she left. He sat with what he had learned. It was very little that the note had not already prepared him for. She had planned the departure carefully. She had taken what was hers and left the rest, the room in order, the objects that had accumulated over a year still in their places, the note where he would find it. She had not left anything unfinished, she had not left in disorder. She had closed it completely, in the way she had written it, deliberately, without gaps through which something could reach her. He considered sending riders. The main road branched at the village crossing, and he had the men to cover all the routes and the authority to compel information from anyone along them. He considered this in the way he considered logistical problems: reach, timeline, variables, probable outcomes. He did not give the order. He was not certain. Sitting in her chair, in her cold room with the note in his hands, that he was the same man who issued orders. He did not know what kind of man he was on the other side of the previous night, and acting from that uncertainty tended to produce actions that required undoing, and he had already accumulated enough of what required undoing. He would sit here a while longer. He folded the note along the crease she had made and placed it inside his coat, into the inner pocket where he kept the things he did not want to lose. The gesture was deliberate. He felt it as deliberate as a decision of a kind he was still capable of making. Then he settled back in the chair and looked at the room around him, her things in their places, the morning light arriving through the window at the angle she had preferred, the cold fireplace, the unwashed cup on the table. He had nowhere else to be. On the third day he found himself in the library in the afternoon. This was not unusual. He used the library often. What was unusual was that he was not there to work. He had come to the window, the one overlooking the garden, and he had been standing at it for some time without knowing exactly why, and eventually he understood that what he was looking at, without having meant to look, was the surface of the reading table, the faint mark where the inkwell had sat, where the pen with a narrow handle had been. The memory arrived the way the others had without announcement. He had not been in the castle when she arrived. He had been in the capital, a period of unusually concentrated duties, meetings he could not defer. His mother had written to him that the woman had come, and that the arrangements were being seen to, and that she was settling in. He had filed this letter in the same category as the household communications he received from the housekeeper, acknowledged, not attended to. He returned 6 weeks later. He had no expectation about what he would find. He had, if he was being precise about it, no particular thoughts about the matter beyond the bare administrative awareness that there was now someone else in the castle, and that certain adjustments to the daily routine had been made to account for her presence. She was in the garden when he arrived. He saw her from the approach road, a figure standing among the late-season growth with, her back to the gate reading something. She did not look up when the carriage came through. He noted this without drawing any conclusion from it. He went inside, received his briefing from the steward, reviewed the accumulated correspondence, and was midway through a report from one of the estate managers when it occurred to him that he had not yet been formally introduced. The introduction took place that evening, in the smaller dining room. She was quiet and correct, and looked directly at him when he spoke, and thanked him for the hospitality of his house in a manner that was precise without being excessive. He could not have said afterward what color her eyes were. He had been attending to the formality of the occasion rather than to her as a person, and she had been doing something similar, he thought, managing the situation rather than being fully present in it. They were both performing the correct version of this meeting. That was the beginning. The early weeks were unremarkable in the way new arrangements are unremarkable when they have been organized by someone else and require only accommodation rather than effort. She was in certain rooms at certain times. She had established without announcement a set of quiet habits. The garden in the mornings before the cold made it unwelcoming, the library in the afternoons, the smaller sitting room in the evenings. He moved around these habits without acknowledging them, and she moved around his without, as far as he could tell, remarking on them either. The castle absorbed her the way it absorbed most things, steadily, without drama. The moment he thought of now had come perhaps a month in. He had been working late in the study, as he frequently did, and had gone to the library to retrieve a volume he needed. She was there. Late, later than he would have expected. From what he had observed of her habits, she was reading by a single candle, and she looked up when he entered, and something crossed her face that he had not been able to categorize at the time, and was only now, standing at the library window with the mark of the absent inkwell in front of him, beginning to interpret. She had looked relieved to see him, just for a moment before the expression resolved back into something appropriate, neutral, polite, the correct distance. Then she had asked if she was disturbing him, and he had said no, and he had taken the book he needed from the shelf, and he had left. He had not thought about that exchange once between the night it happened and this morning. It had been a small thing. It had been nothing at all. He stood at the window looking at the surface of the table, and he understood that it had not been nothing, and that the woman sitting alone with a single candle late at night, who had looked briefly relieved when he walked in, had been glad, specifically glad, for a specific reason, to see him, and that he had taken his book and left without asking what she was still doing there so late, and that he would never be able to go back to that doorway and do it differently. He was in her room again when the second memory came. He had moved through the castle that morning in the way he did not normally move, slowly, without destination, pausing in doorways and at windows, attending to rooms in a manner he had not attended to anything in years. He had eaten something at some point, though he could not have said what or when. The note was in his inner pocket, and he was aware of it constantly, the way you are aware of a wound you have stopped touching but not stopped feeling. This memory was deeper than the last. It had come perhaps 6 months after the one in the library, deeper into their shared year, into the period when the initial formality between them had settled into something more permanent that he had considered, at the time, quite adequate. They had found their respective territories. They did not intrude on each other. He had considered this an arrangement of considerable mutual dignity, and he had been pleased with it in the distant, administrative way. He was pleased when things were orderly. He had been at his desk in the study when she came. She knocked, which she always did. She never entered his rooms without announcement, a courtesy he had appreciated without acknowledging. He told her to come in. She came in and stood for a moment at a slight distance from his desk, and said that she had been wondering, if he had time, whether he might tell her about the estate, not the accounts. She had already spoken with the steward about those. She meant the older parts of it, the history of the place. Whether he knew anything about who had built the original walls, what the property had been like when his family first came to it. He had looked up from his papers. She was asking. He understood now, about him. She was asking him to tell her something that was his, not a fact about the property, but a thread leading from the place back to himself, back to whatever he had felt about it as a boy, back to something she could not have gotten from the steward's account books. She was extending something toward him through the only angle available to her. The oblique approach of a person who could not ask directly for what she wanted. He had told her about the Eastern Wall. He had told her the construction date and the name of the stone, local limestone, from a quarry that had since closed, and the period of the original fortification, and the approximate cost of the renovation his grandfather had undertaken. He had told her all of this accurately, and in organized order, and with the particular brisk clarity he brought to any topic he knew well. He had been, he thought at the time, quite informative. She had thanked him. She had said it was very interesting. She had said she was glad she had asked, in the precise tone of a person who was being correct rather than glad. And then she had left. He had returned to his papers. Kay had returned to his papers. He had considered the exchange entirely unremarkable. He considered it now from a different position. She had stood in front of his desk with a question that was not about walls. And he had answered the question about walls. He had given her everything she had technically asked for, and nothing she had actually wanted. And he had not known the difference. The gap had been so complete and so ordinary to him that he had not noticed the moment pass, the moment when he might have said, "Why do you ask?" Or "What made you think of it?" Or simply, "Would you like to sit down?" He had not said any of those things. He had answered her question, and she had thanked him, and the door had closed. He knew when she had stopped trying. He could not identify the exact date, but he knew that at some point the quality of her presence in the castle had changed. She had continued to be there, in the library, in the garden, at the table, but something had receded that had been present before. He had noticed this the way he noticed most things about her. As a fact, he registered and did not examine. He had thought, on the few occasions he had thought about it at all, that she was simply settling deeper into the routine. He understood now that she had not been settling. He had watched, without knowing he was watching, as she learned not to extend herself toward him. He had provided that education thoroughly, and without knowing he was providing it. And she, being who she was, had learned it quietly and without complaint, and had continued to inhabit the castle and his periphery and his daily life, and had said nothing of what she was carrying, and had carried it alone for a long time, until she could not carry it any further inside these walls. He sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the floor. And what he felt was not sorrow exactly. It was something more permanent than sorrow. It was the recognition of something that could not be undone by feeling it. He had moved at some point during the night, from the chair to the bed. He did not remember deciding to. He was simply there now, lying with his coat on in the dark, and through the window the sky had gone from black to the particular gray that arrived before color, and he was thinking about what she had done. He had not seen it. He had not been there. He was constructing this from the evidence she had left behind. The note, the missing things, the room she had arranged with the care of someone who did not intend to return to it. He was building her departure from her handwriting and the shape of an inkwell's absence. This was what remained of her for him to know. He thought she would have woken early. Not necessarily because she had been sleeping. She may have stopped sleeping, well, some time before this, but because early was when the house was most quiet. When he was unlikely to be in a corridor, he knew her well enough for this much. She would have wanted to leave without a conversation she could not manage, and she would have planned the timing accordingly. He thought about what had brought her to it. Not a single morning he understood that now it had accumulated. She had tried to undo it. She had written, and he believed her. She had tried and come eventually to the hour, whichever hour it was, when she understood clearly that she was not going to stop, and that remaining in a place where she could not stop was a choice, and that she could make a different one. He thought about the note. He thought about how many times she must have written it before she wrote the one she left. He had held that note in his hands for the better part of 2 days now, and he knew its particular quality. Careful, measured, not accusatory, not desperate. That was not the first version she had written. The first versions would have been something else. They would have said things she could not leave on a table to be found, things that could not be read in the wrong order, in the wrong hour, by someone who was not yet ready to receive them. She would have written those versions and then put them in the fire. The note he had found was the note she could finish, the words she could arrange into something that would not cost her more than she could afford in the writing. He thought about her at the writing table. The cleared surface, the inkwell, the pen with the narrow handle, writing and stopping, and writing again, crossing something out, setting the pen down, and arriving, somewhere in that process, at the decision to write it plainly, "I loved you," looking at it on the page, and writing it again. He thought about her standing up when the note was done. She had taken what she needed. One bag, the kitchen girl's accountant said, possibly two. She had not taken everything. Looking at the room in the grey morning light, he could see what she had left. The books, the candle burned to a stub in its holder, the folded cloth on the table. These were not forgotten objects. They were things she had looked at and set aside, either because she had decided they were not hers to take, or because she had looked at them and could not continue looking. He thought about her at the door. She would not have looked at everything. He did not believe she had allowed herself to look at everything. It would have made it impossible to go. She would have allowed herself one thing. He believed she had allowed herself to look at the writing table, the surface where she had sat through however many evenings it had taken, and then she had gone down the stairs and through the hall and out the gate, and the castle had been ordinary around her in every step until she crossed the threshold. And after that, the castle had become the thing he had returned to, her shape remaining in the air where she had been, and the silence that was the exact size of her. He understood the note differently now than he had when he first read it. It was not a document. It was the last thing she had made in this place. Made at a cost he had not grasped when he read it and now grasped fully. She had made it for him. She had made it with the same care she brought to everything, and she had placed it where he would find it, and she had walked out. He lay in her room in the growing light with the note against his chest and looked at the ceiling and knew everything. He knew he got up. He did not plan to get up. He was simply lying in her room in the early light. And then he was not lying down anymore. He was standing with one hand on the bedpost and his coat still on from the day before, the note still in his inner pocket, the room around him exactly as it had been. He went to the basin and washed his face. The water was cold. No one had come in to lay a fire or heat water, or if they had come to the door, they had retreated, which was perhaps the clearest evidence he had of what the last 2 days had looked like from the outside. He dried his face with a cloth that was hers and placed it back where he had found it. Then he went downstairs. The castle was resuming around him. It had, he found, continued to operate in his absence from it. Fires laid in the main rooms, the kitchen making the sounds of the morning, the steward in the passage near the east hall, who stopped with the expression of a man who had been preparing himself for this encounter. He told the steward that breakfast would not be necessary. The steward said, "Very good," and nothing further, and they parted. A more careful exchange than their usual, and he noted this. He found the housekeeper in the linen room. He knocked. She came to the door with the stillness of someone who had been expecting to be found. He asked her, not in the tone he used for household matters, but in a quieter register that he was apparently now capable of, whether she knew anything more about the morning she had left. Which road? Whether she had said anything at all to anyone before she went. The housekeeper told him what she knew, which was not much more than he already had. She had left early and been orderly about it. She had said a brief goodbye to one of the kitchen girls, not to the housekeeper, not to anyone in a senior position, in a way that was kind and gave nothing away. The coach had taken the northern road from the village, which branched 3 ways within a mile. He thanked her. She looked at him when he thanked her, the particular look of a person who is adjusting their understanding of something, and then she nodded, and he left. He stood in the passage. She had not left him a way to find her. She had taken the northern road, and the northern road divided, and she could be anywhere that road eventually reached. She had said, in the note, "I am not telling anyone where I am going." She had asked him plainly not to look for her. She had said it in the plainest terms she was capable of, which were very plain, and she had been correct that he was a practical man and would understand. He was a practical man. He understood what she had meant. He also understood, standing in that passage on the 3rd morning after her departure, that she had written the note because there was no other way she knew to say what she needed to say. She had set it on paper because she could not say it to his face. She had given him the truest letter she had ever written and then removed herself from the range of his response, because she had learned, and he had taught her, that there was no point in waiting for a response he had never given. He was going to give one. Not today. He was not going to send riders up the northern road with a duke's authority and a duke's assumption that what he wanted and what was right were the same thing. He was done with that kind of certainty. But he was going to find her. He was going to find her and say to her face what she had deserved to hear from him while she was still in this castle, and he was going to say it without the distance, without the managing, without answering the walls when she was the one in the room. He did not know yet exactly what kind of man he was now. He was not going to know that by standing in the passage. He was going to have to find out by moving. He turned and went back into the castle to begin. He moved through the castle in the early afternoon, which was the first time in 3 days that he had moved through it, as himself rather than as a man coming undone. The rooms were the same rooms. The hall was the same hall, the long table, the candlesticks, the ceramic bowl. The passage toward the east wing ran the same direction it had always run, and the kitchen sounds that had been absent when he arrived had returned to their ordinary register. Nothing had been moved. Nothing had been changed. Everything was different. He walked the passage slowly, and understood for the first time something about the year she had spent in these rooms. She had not altered any of it. She was not the kind of person who altered things, but she had inhabited it. He could see, looking into the smaller parlor through its open door where she had and had not sat. The chair near the left window had its cushion at an angle his own use would not have produced. The chair near the right window was precisely as it had always been. She had liked the left window. He had not known this, and now he did, and he would not unknow it. In the library, he stopped at the reading table. The inkwell was still absent. The pen was still absent. He had not replaced them, and he was not going to replace them. Not a conscious decision, but apparently a decision he had made. He stood at the table and looked at the surface, and thought about how gradually her things had arrived here, and how precisely they had departed, and how much could be understood about a person from the particular objects they chose to carry away. He took the note from his inner pocket. He did not unfold it entirely. He opened it to the last page and read the final line once. "Take care of yourself. I mean that." He read it from the other side of everything he now knew about the year she had spent meaning, and what happened in his chest was not quite grief. It was something closer to receipt. He received what she had sent him, finally, in full. He folded the note and put it back. He went to his study and spent 2 hours on the correspondence that had accumulated during his 3 days' absence. He handled it with the particular attention of a man who has been away from himself and is returning to ordinary competence as a means of re-entry. He was efficient. He was organized. These qualities had not changed. What had changed was the reason for them. He was not clearing this desk because order was the point. He was clearing it so that he could leave it in order. When he was done, he went to the entrance hall. He stood in the place he had stood when he first came through the doors 3 days ago, when the silence had been enormous and he had not yet understood what it contained. He looked at the hall. It was not silent now. The household had resumed. There were sounds from the kitchen corridor, the distant creak of the upper gallery in the wind. The hall was simply a hall. He understood now what it had been 3 days ago. The silence had been her shape in the rooms she had just left, the exact dimensions of her absence, which he had not been able to name because he had not known her shape well enough to recognize when it was gone. He knew it now. He knew it in the way you know the size of something after it is no longer there to measure. He took his coat from the chair beside the door and put it on. The limestone gravel road was the same road it had always been, packed hard by the same decades of cartwheels, flanked by the same oaks, whose leaves were beginning to shift their color in the same autumn. He had come up this road 3 days ago, thinking about correspondence. He had noted the turned leaves and catalogued them, and felt nothing about them in particular, because there had been nothing as yet to feel about them. He walked down it now in the direction that went away from the castle rather than toward it. The gate stood open behind him. The castle stood where it had always stood, the pale stone face, the east tower with its permanent slight lean, the iron gate his grandfather's architect had assured him was structurally inconsequential. It was all there. It would be there when he returned. He did not look back at it. He had been a man who came home to a silent castle and had not known what the silence was. The note she left had destroyed that man as thoroughly as she had promised it would. What was walking down the road now was something that had not existed 3 days ago, a man who knew what he had failed to see and who was going to find the woman who had taught him to see it, and who had for the first time in as long as he could examine